Good morning. I'm Dr. Jay-Z Bennett, and I would like to welcome you to the 2022 Center for Urban Education Summer Education Forum of CUESEF. For those of you who joined us, who joined us before, we say welcome back. It's great to be in community with you again. And for those of you who may be the first time or new to the CUESEF family, we say buckle up and put your seatbelts on because we have so much in store for you this week. I will be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that we are or have been living and experiencing some challenged times, global pandemic, police brutality, racial divide, civil unrest, and the recent mass shootings. But as my grandmother once said, is that tough times don't last, tough people do. And one of the central areas of our focus at the Center for Urban Education is people. And that broadly encompasses our local community, families, organizations, public and private sectors in Pittsburgh and the surrounding region, school communities nationally, students, parents, and administrators, as well as our colleagues in the scholarly community, professors, authors, researchers, and other collaborators. We have gathered for this conference today and during the week because we need people who have a vision of hope for new possibilities. And as Dr. West reminds us, hope and optimism are different. Optimism usually tends to see the facts or the notion that there's enough evidence to believe things are going to get better. It's more rational, deeply secular. Whereas hope looks at the evidence and says it doesn't look good at all. The evidence is not promising. But hope goes beyond the evidence to create new possibilities based on visions that become contagious, to allow people to engage in heroic actions and allow them against the odds. Like many of our heroic ancestors in the Black knowledge traditions, it is in this vision of hope that we ask ourselves, how might our work shift if we acknowledge that we are not heading towards a crisis, but we have currently already been existing in one? How might we develop and use our imaginative and creative capacities to not legitimize, tweak, reform, or repackage current structures, but instead reimagine education as a practice of freedom? It is in this year's free virtual CUESEF that our theme invites our panelists and speakers to think beyond our current crisis about teacher shortages, anti-critical race theory policies, and COVID impacts, into the long-standing struggles for liberating education, both locally and globally. We have a wide array of dynamic speakers, and their session maps the possibilities for study as well as change through examination of teacher education, school leadership, policy context, homeschooling, school-prison nexus, food and environmental justice, and much more. We have a great week prepared for this. We have DJ Selectus who will be giving us tunes to get us through all of our sessions. And we invite you to join us for a week that's filled with learning, community building, and dynamic dialogue. And now we'll have remarks from Dr. Valerie Kinlock, who is the Renee and Richard Goldman Dean of the University of Pittsburgh School of Education. Dr. Kinlock has been integral in strengthening the School of Education's commitments to urban education, equity and justice, diversity, inclusion, and community engagement.
Hi, I am Valerie Kinlock, the Renee and Richard Goldman Endowed Dean of our School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. And I could not be more excited to welcome you to the 2022 Center for Urban Education Summer Educators Forum. The theme this year, Beyond the Crisis, Education for Local and Global Liberation, is such an important theme. And I could not be more excited to be in this space with you, to welcome you, to thank you, and to offer some introductory words and reflections on how I myself am taking up this theme in practice. Dr. Elon Dansy is our executive director for the Center for Urban Education, and he works with our wonderful faculty and staff and students. And together, they have asked us to think about some really pressing questions. Some of those questions include, what would it mean to understand the everyday practices of schools and schooling as in and of crisis? How is, quote, a return to normal still a return to a state of crisis? How might our work shift if we acknowledge that we are not heading toward a crisis, but in fact, we're already in one? We are existing within a crisis that we cannot ignore. Another question that is really appropriate and relevant to the work that I do: how might we develop and use our imaginative and creative capacities, not to try to legitimize, tweak, reform, or even repackage current structures, but instead to reimagine, as Bell Hooks tells us, that education is the practice of freedom. And that, my friends, is what motivates me to do this work, to strive for the reality that education must become the practice of freedom in our schools, in our communities, in our universities, in our societies, wherever we might find ourselves. In fact, it is in this very moment that we must continue to understand that we are in crisis. And we have to figure out ways to not remain in crisis, but to work toward, or as June Jordan would say, to move toward freedom and liberation and transformation. Here in the School of Education, that is the work that we have begun to do. That is the work that we take seriously. And that is the work that is at the center of all of our initiatives, our programs, our activities, our teaching, our research, our engagement with each other and with other people beyond the School of Education and even beyond the university. You know, it's in our mission vision statement where we write and we say and we proclaim that we ignite learning, that we strive for well-being for all, that we commit to student, family, and community success. We also state that we advocate, we research, we teach, we disrupt inequitable educational structures. We understand learning as intertwined with health, wellness, and human development. We disrupt, we agitate, we innovate. And importantly, in relation to this theme of beyond the crisis, we understand that we work with and for dignity and integrity, that we dream, that we search for a better world, not just for ourselves and for each other, but for those not yet here. This is the work we do as we seek to move beyond crisis and understand liberation within local, national, and global settings. And finally, let me also reflect on the role that I play as president of the National Council of Teachers of English, NCTE, a national organization of 25,000 plus members across this nation. Teachers, researchers, community advocates and activists, students, people who are committed to thinking about and practicing and taking up structures that are equitable and just. And in fact, just a few months ago, I led the writing of a statement that's about solidarity for teachers and with teaching. And in that statement, I wrote that teachers are well aware that we are all living, existing, and working in uncertain times. Teachers know the devastating impact of, for example, COVID-19, of ongoing racial violence that have had and continue to have on the social, emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of ourselves, of themselves, of our students, of every single one of us. And in fact, teachers know that children and young adults are watching us. They are asking us, what are we going to do? They are hoping that we will continue to not only see them, but also to protect them, to care for them, to cultivate love, learn with and from them, to honor them as human beings. And so it is our responsibility, whether as members of the National Council of Teachers of English, whether as members of the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh, or as members of any community that you are here representing today. It is our responsibility to understand how to not only show up, but how to be present in the midst of crises, and how do we figure out ways to seek our freedom and liberation out of crises and into, with so many Black feminist thinkers and intellectuals say, freedom for all, particularly Black people, centering Black women, and understanding that we have work to do as we imagine how education must in fact be the practice of freedom. I also want to state that in the statement on solidarity that I helped write, I also referenced James Baldwin's talk to teachers, 1963. And we all know very well, but particularly teachers, we know that the paradox, and I quote James Baldwin, the paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated. And that's from James Baldwin. Now, this is not easy work to do, in fact, but it is necessary work that we must do if we are going to recommit to responsibly living, learning, and teaching in a world of justice, fairness, kindness, and freedom. There is no other way to say it. We must understand the crises that we are in. We must understand the ways that we must love and honor, respect, and care for each other, particularly the youngest and oldest of us. We are indeed inspired and should be inspired by teachers, by educators, by community activists, by intellectuals, by freedom dreamers and freedom doers to commit to each other. We have to engage in this work of disrupting and innovating and agitating. We must transform lives as we transform, in fact, learning situations and conditions for all of us. I want to end by using the words of poet, educator, feminist June Jordan. And in 1973, she gave a speech on the value of Black language. She delivered this speech to the Maryland Department of Education. And she talked about teachers understanding that we can, and I quote, not divorce ourselves from our experience. And we cannot, and I quote, not deny the history of our life as a people, nor will we permit the definition of our future to take place in the terms of and the language of those who do not love us, who have never loved us. And that's from June Jordan's 1973 speech to the Maryland Department of Education. The point here is that when we study, when we think about struggle, when we think about perseverance, when we think fundamentally about the histories in which we are embedded in, and we remember those histories because we study those histories, then we rely on someone like June Jordan who says, what is it that we are honoring and who are we honoring? And are we being complicit in the harm that gets enacted onto us by structures and policies and people who do not love us and who have never loved us and probably never will? We cannot be complicit. We have to engage in transformation. And as we take the words of James Baldwin in his talk to teachers, the paradox of education is precisely that when one becomes conscious, one begins to examine everything around himself or herself or themselves. And one begins to ask different types of questions as we seek different types of solutions for our transformation from our silences and into freedom and liberation. As president of NCTE, as the dean of the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh, as a thinker, as an educator, as a researcher, as a human being, I welcome you to the 2022 Center for Urban Education Summer Educators Forum. And it is my hope that you will take the guiding questions of this forum, you will map them on to what we know from James Baldwin and June Jordan, and you will continue to persevere in the ways that you are disrupting inequitable educational structures. And when you understand that we are not heading toward a crisis, we are already in crises. And how are we going to save ourselves and those people who are yet to be here? This is the work we have to do in schools and communities. This is the work we do at the University of Pittsburgh School of Education. And this is the work that the Center for Urban Education is doing, not just this week, but every single day. So, as Dean of the School of Education, I welcome you, I thank you, and I encourage you to continue doing this great work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kinlock, for those remarks. And now for a man who really needs no introduction and the visionary of the CUESEF concert, I would like to introduce Dr. T. Elon Dansy II, who serves as the Elon S. Faison Endowed Chair, Executive Director, and also Chief Research Scientist of the Center for Urban Education at the University of Pittsburgh School of Education. His own scholarly agenda draws on the Black knowledge tradition and critical theories to examine education as a site of struggle and world making with a focus on Black American population. And he's highly regarded for his studies of Black masculinity and patriarchy in post-secondary contexts, anti-Blackness in higher education, and political economies of education. Dr. Dansy does this with an ethic, what I call love, which the proverb reminds us to explore our work, to be patient and to be kind, and not to rejoice about injustice, but only when the truth rings out. Dr. Dansy seeks to anchor the Center for Urgent Education in Black and Indigenous knowledge traditions, political education, and collaborative community-based practice. So the center's extensive programs and initiative include a whole host of national and local convenings in the school to prison nexus, Black education histories, and education and freedom practices. Dr. Dansy has received research awards from several national institutions and associations, and also has received over $5 million in funding at the University of Pittsburgh for his scholarship projects from several foundation and agencies, including the Spencer Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Hounds Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the Grable Foundation, and the McAllen Foundation. Dr. Dansy is also the author and co-author of nearly 100 journal articles, book chapters, monograms, and publications related to education and society, and is working on a forthcoming book with the University Press of Kentucky entitled Freedom Struggles in Urban Appalachia, Resisting Pittsburgh Schools, Prisons, and Carcerality, along with Dr. Sabina Vaught and Laurie Dell O'Connor. He's also completing a special issue of educational studies with Dr. Kirsten Edwards, focused on the relationship between the American College and the chattel slave plantation, as well as a special issue in the Negro Education Review with Dr. Juan Battle, examining university statements following the state murder of George Floyd and global uprising. I present to some and introduce to others Dr. T. Elon Dansy II.
Thank you, Jawan, for that kind and generous introduction. Good morning and welcome to the Pitt School of Education Center for Urban Education Summer Educator Forum, or CUESEF 2022. For those who are returning, welcome back. And for those who are new to the Summer Educator Forum, we're delighted you have joined us. We come to you again virtually this year in recognition of an enduring COVID-19 pandemic that continues with high rates of viral transmission in the nation and in the city of Pittsburgh. Far too many deaths and severe illness, and far too much indifference to our collective well-being and our collective responsibility. In deciding to host a virtual forum this year, we studied the available data and determined it was best that we come to you in a way that refuses to participate in super spreading a virus that has killed over 6.7 million people globally, and Native people, Black people, and people of color disproportionately. Our commitment is also reinforced by the escalating costs in our current moment that make travel to our convening more and more unreasonable. Embracing the opportunity that a virtual broadcast provides, the center invites Pittsburgh, the country, and the world into conversations about education for local and global liberation. As you may know, we were inspired this year by the words of writer and activist James Baldwin, whose prophetic 1963 speech titled "A Talk to Teachers" could not be more relevant. We are in a revolutionary situation, no matter how unpopular that word has become in this country, Baldwin writes. Any of us who think ourselves responsible, and particularly those of us dealing with the hearts and minds of young people, must be prepared to go for broke and to understand that there will be brutal resistance in the attempt to correct many generations of bad faith and cruelty. This speech points to a valuable intervention for this year's CUESEF. How do our daily conversations about crises in schools and schooling distract us from the larger focus on what Baldwin described as the generations of bad faith and cruelty that distinguish the entire system? How is a return to normal still a return to crisis? What if our understanding of normal actually works to disguise crisis? What if the massacres in Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde, Texas, do not suggest we are heading toward a crisis, but we have been existing in one? Remember, the Baldwin speech was in 1963 and not 2022. And if we confront this, how might we develop and use our imaginative and creative capacities not to try to legitimize, tweak, reform, or repackage current structures, but instead to reimagine education as a practice of freedom? These questions compel us in this year's CUESEF. We ask you to think with us beyond trendy crisis conversations into how these moments serve as portals to liberatory education and for liberatory education. We have confirmed plenaries and workshops with many thinkers who will support us in mapping coordinates for power and change. We begin our forum in the week of Juneteenth, a day which asks us to devote ourselves to the project of emancipation. This is not coincidental, it is intentional. And by the end, we hope you are motivated to commit to continued study about principles and practices that forge futures of freedom in so many contexts of unfreedom. Borrowing from the late Maya Angelou's writing, I may come here to greet you as one, but I stand as many. So I take time in these remarks to express gratitude for the assembly of persons who have worked hard to make this year's CUESEF rich and thoughtful. I'm grateful for my colleague Sabina Vaught, who thought with me about a design for this year's forum, the University of Pittsburgh Center for Urban Education team, the faculty, staff, and students who have supported our forum planning and execution. I am grateful to our visiting center faculty from other colleges and universities who have invested time and labor preparing the dialogues that shape the forum's plenaries. We thank our producer, Fantasy Zellers, and her Bounce Limited team for their hard work and care of the forum behind the scenes. We thank our community partners and residents whose thinking and advisement help to identify topics and participants. We thank the administrators and staff in the School of Education, particularly our Dean, Dr. Valerie Kinlock, the University of Pittsburgh Technology Departments supporting us in our virtual forum, and the Kyle Duarte Company providing more inclusive American Sign Language. Art is education, and we thank the artists who remind us this year that art is central to movements for justice and liberation. We invited local Pittsburgh visual artist and Pitt alum Morgan Overton to inspire our theme. We thank her for her piece Obsidian, which interprets this year's theme and conveys Morgan's own commitment as an artist to reflect the times. We're also grateful to DJ Selecta, who has meditated on our theme and is taking us on musical journeys during forum breaks. Now, you don't want to miss that either. Finally, we are grateful to our forum sponsors who have supported the Center for Urban Education's commitment to offering a free forum to all attendees as an act of public service. Thank you, Duquesne University School of Education, University Council for Education Administration's Center for Educational Leadership and Social Justice. That School of Education is under the leadership of our friend and colleague, Dean Gretchen Jenneret. Also, the Temple University School of Education in Philadelphia, under the leadership of our friend and colleague, Dr. James Earl Davis, and the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. Let me remind you that if you are not signed up to receive updates from the Pitt Center for Urban Education, we can fix this easily. Please visit our website at q.pitt.edu, that's cue.pitt.edu, click Contact, and complete a very brief form to join our mailing list so that you can stay up to date about our events and initiatives. Thanks for being with us virtually this summer. Enjoy CUESEF 2022, Beyond the Crisis, Education for Local and Global Liberation. And now, I have the high honor of introducing our first speaker, who is a gift and treasure in education research and higher education administration. Dr. Cynthia Dillard is Dean of the College of Education at Seattle University. She went to that role upon a scaffolding of key academic posts in higher education, including, among others, Chair of the Department of Educational Theory and Practice at the University of Georgia, and Associate Dean for Equity and Diversity at The Ohio State University. Dr. Dillard is a distinguished scholar whose work has included research on intersections of race, culture, gender, and spirituality, particularly in the context of teaching and education. She has authored or edited 4 books, with the most current, the spirit of our work, Black Women Teachers Remember, providing the focus of our opening plenary. Dr. Dillard has written a multitude of articles, book chapters, and other scholarly pieces, while frequently presenting as a keynote speaker or panelist at national conferences. She has received more than a dozen awards and recognitions, including the 2019 Taylor and Francis Award for Lifetime Achievement from the American Educational Studies Association. Dr. Dillard's belief in the transformative power of education is matched by her commitment to serving others and making an impact in communities near and far. As president and founder of Give, Build, Share, Dr. Dillard has led an effort to build schools in rural areas of Ghana, giving students educational opportunities that previously were not available. And we are fortunate in CUESEF 2022 that she has graciously co-designed a workshop directly following her plenary, where we can learn from the philosophies and practices of these schools. But first, the plenary. Please join me in welcoming our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Cynthia Diller, who following her talk will be joined in dialogue with our moderator, Dr. Kirsten T. Edwards, who is visiting faculty from Florida International University in Miami, where she serves as Associate Professor of Higher Education. Dr. Dillard and Dr. Edwards, welcome.
All right, everybody. Are we good this morning? Are we good this morning? I'm just excited to be here looking out over at Lake Union in Washington, but I have a few thank yous I need to do first before I get started in any talk. First of all, I want to thank the ancestors and God who woke me up this morning because I still have work to do. I want to thank the folks at Pitt Q and certainly my good friend, Elon Dansy, along with my good friend, Valerie Kinlock, the Dean of the College of Education there. I want to thank you for putting this incredible event together. And I am honored to be able to keynote this event around the crisis in education and our connections globally and locally around liberation. I also want to thank those of you who are on this call this morning. This is an important sort of moment for us to think about freedom. So I just want to thank you for being here and pray that the words that I speak might come to your ears in a way that moves you to work more carefully in the spirit of our work. Now, my comments today center on ideas about liberation and the global nature of our being as teachers. And they are focused on my book, The Spirit of Our Work, Black Women Teachers Remember. This book is a book about remembering. It's a book about what happens when Black women in the Black diaspora return to the continent of Africa for sources of wisdom and powerful ways that such a journey can change our lives from the inside out. But it's also about so much more. It's about how these acts of remembering literally shift and transform our bodies, minds, and spirits. It is about how those shifts create what Akasha Hall calls a new spirituality for Black women, one deeply committed to an expanded politics, a spiritual consciousness, and acts of engaging creativity in a way that both takes us off our center and gives us back our center at the same time. And it is a book about the beauty and wisdom embodied in the spirit of some of the most important people in the lives of any community, Black women who teach. I often recount the story, and I do so in the book as well, from the iconic film by Julie Dash called Daughters of the Dust. In this film, Nana Pazant is the matriarch of the family who descended from a great line of enslaved African people on the island of Daughter. Now, this rather secluded island is located on the barrier coast of present-day South Carolina and Georgia. Given modernization and a dying indigo industry, moving from this small island to the perceived greener pastures of the United States mainland were the dreams of her family. Staying behind on the island and faced with the impending separation of this family, Nana, the grandmother, has a serious conversation with her great-grandson, Eli, a conversation where he tries to share with her why he needs to leave the island. Her goal is not to persuade him to stay. Her goal is to help him remember who he is once he's left, to remember the soul of his people and the memory of the wisdom of their memories. So the conversation goes a bit like this. Nana says to Eli, there's a thought, a recollection, something somebody remembers. We carry those memories inside of we. Do you believe that hundreds and hundreds of Africans brought here on this side would forget everything they once knew? We don't know where the recollections come from, Eli. Sometimes we dream them, but we carry those memories inside we. Now, Eli says to Nana, actually quite sarcastically, he says, what are we supposed to remember, Nana? How at one time we were able to protect those we loved? How in the African world we were kings and queens and built great cities? Now, Nana speaks back to Eli and she's literally pleading, Eli, I'm trying to teach you how to touch your own spirit. I'm fighting for my life, Eli, and I'm fighting for yours. Look at my face. I'm trying to give you something to take north with you, along with all those big dreams. Nana's words this morning and every time I read them make me catch my breath. In her voice are the dilemmas of formerly enslaved Africans living in the diaspora, those dilemmas that we still carry inside we today. Dilemmas about who we are, what we have forgotten, what we've chosen to remember, and the revolution that remembering might create. Now, here and throughout this book, I posit remembering as both the acts of putting back together, as in remembering, and the act of recalling, as in the call or the spiritual obligation that we answer when we become teachers, or frankly, aunties or mothers or any other important role in our communities. Remembering is also an act of resistance, given the continuous ways that Black people and our presence in the diaspora is rendered invisible within structures of capitalism, patriarchy, and other anti-Black structures of domination. Marshaling the prefix re in parentheses is my way of reminding all of us that Black people have inherently and always existed as brilliant holders of knowledge, culture, and humanity. Thus, remembering is not an initial or an original recognition or recognition of Black brilliance. It is used to remind us all of what Black people have already known about ourselves always, in every context that consistently acts otherwise. Now, Nana Pizant's voice also reminds us that touching our own spirits is at the center of our remembering and our being, our literal being. She teaches that our very spirits and lives are worth fighting for. Most importantly, remembering is a promise to all of the ancestors. Touching our spirits is literally a covenant that we have made with them who chose to survive so that we might have the awesome opportunity to thrive as Black people. Now, Nana's talk with Eli embodies African thought and ways of being as well. In their conversation, there's an ever-present link between those who have come before, those who are here now, and those who will come in the future. This link undergirds an Akan proverb from Ghana, represented in the well-known symbol of Sankofa, which means to go back and fetch what you need from that past, to build what you collectively need in this present and what we call the future. I'm suggesting here that for Black women who teach, to Sankofa is also a covenant between our spirits and the spirits of our ancestors and elders like Nana Pizant. We must remember ourselves and our ways of thinking and knowing as Black people in order to teach from that deep well of Black brilliance, Black wisdom, and Black joy. And that process is an example worthy of emulation. Now, this covenant that we have with the ancestors has two parts. We usually remember one and we sometimes forget the other. The first part is an agreement or a promise between two or more parties, especially for the performance of some action. Now, we tend to remember that one. But leaning on the rest of that dictionary definition, a covenant is also the common law action to recover damages for the breach of such contract. Given these definitions, it's important for all of us to ask the question, as Black women teachers and as teachers more generally, what are the promises that we must make to honor the sacrifices of these Black ancestors? How do we recover damages for the breaches of the contracts that have been broken and the greatness of the generations to come? I'm suggesting here this morning that the work of Black women teachers and the work that we do is part of the covenant we've made with those who have chosen to survive. Some of us have literally answered that call to teach or to lead, in my case, after we have exhausted what were other certainly more financially lucrative or higher status professions. Some of us knew from our very early years that education was our vocation of choice. Others of us began in other professions like myself and switched when we could not bear to see the violence being done to our babies. Regardless of how and when we entered or where we entered, many of us have found multiple places of tension and separation between our spiritual and our personal lives and our academic and scholarly and leadership lives. Sometimes these separations are out of necessity. Other times, these separations are our response to a mandate or because we assumed that we had to. But in moments where we see that spark of brilliance or that spark of fire in a Black student, or in our interactions with Black parents about their children who hold that same fire, or in drawing on scholars and texts and curriculum centered in the words and thoughts of Black authors, writers, and theorists, we have engaged in a spirituality of remembering. We have honored the covenants that we have made with the ancestors, drawing on that deep well of Black brilliance, Black wisdom, and Black joy. This is the knowledge and cultural connections that did not start our heritage story as enslaved people, but rather we started that on the continent of Africa. Explicitly, or maybe more implicitly, even disconsciously, as Joyce King speaks about, these ways of knowing and being have traveled throughout the African diaspora and continue to live in Black American cultures. Sometimes we are able to understand and acknowledge these links. Sometimes we either cannot or have not understood them, or both. But to understand the long struggles for freedom and thus the struggles for liberation, Black identity and education that is worthy of Black people must remember that we come from those who chose to survive those horrors and atrocities, from slavery to this thing we now call freedom. That survival was not only about Black bodies and minds, it was also about our spirits and spiritualities too. It was about how we spiritually animated our survival. It was about how the ancestors knew at that time that we were the future they could already see. That future that is possible to become what Nigerian American comedian Yvonne Orji calls a whole me. We who live in Black diaspora must understand that our narrative is informed by Black narratives that remember our spiritualities as Black people and our legacies of resistance, persistence, and responsibility. That our existence in the Americas is intimately and inextricably bound up with people we now refer to as Ghanaians or Barbadians or Jamaicans, Nigerians, Kenyans, and South Africans, to name a few. And for diasporic Black women, teachers, and leaders, I believe it's our responsibility to remember, because when we remember these covenants with the ancestors on whose shoulders we all stand today, it is our living demonstration of the commitment that is required to teach Black students and others in their wholeness, body, mind, and spirit. Now, you may have seen that T-shirt that Ava is wearing that proclaims boldly in Black and white, "We are our ancestors' wildest dreams." In prioritizing our covenants with them as Black women who teach, not only do we remember ourselves, our students will then have the chance to remember their full humanity, their spirits, and their brilliant dreams too. As teachers and students, we carry those lessons inside we. Now, the book, The Spirit of Our Work, Black Women Teachers Remember, is my humble, frankly humble, manifestation of that dream. It is a recognition or recognition that when Black women teachers and leaders remember who we are and recognize our relationship to our real selves and our real stories, we are that Black girl magic that our students and others deserve, that the ancestors must have prayed and certainly died for, and the future for which they survived. Now, I want to focus the remainder of my time in a read aloud
I would imagine
of the last chapter, which is one of my favorites of the book. It's called Remembering is Not Optional, a love letter to those who
probably
teach.
the fourth button from the left.
In the short time I have left, I want to read an excerpt from it to you today.
Yeah.
As educators, leaders, and researchers,
bottom right corner,
both
bottom
present and
right-hand
future,
corner.
I can only hope
Looks like a full
that you
screen
will
button.
consider the ways that your own spirituality, your politics, your spiritual consciousness, that may include your religion, and your creativity, how those things are central to the work you are choosing, and frankly, that is choosing you. So this is chapter 7, a little excerpt from chapter 7. Remembering is not optional. A love letter to those who teach. My dearest teachers, this is a love letter from my heart to yours. It is a love letter for who you are and what you do in this incredible work of teaching. I write this letter in hopes that you might both push and nurture your spiritual growth as a human and as a teacher, but I also write it as a reminder to you of something crucially important in this moment and always. Remembering is not optional. I start with the words from the brilliant Haitian writer Edwidge Dandicat, who issues a charge to all of us who write, a charge that also applies to all of us who teach. She says this: create dangerously for people who read dangerously, knowing in part that no matter how trivial your words may seem, someday, somewhere, someone may risk his or her life, their life, to read them. Somewhere, if not now, as writers or teachers, we may also save someone's life. My hope is that when you have this book, that you will read it dangerously, that somewhere within these pages you have found inspiration to approach teaching, learning, and living in very different ways, and maybe for very different purposes. Dandicat shares how the work of reading, writing, and remembering, on which teaching relies, are always dangerous undertakings. She speaks of how the work of an intellectual is the work of an artist, of creating the world through one's words, one's art, one's very life. I hope you feel the same way about teaching. Her call is one that incites us to look both forward and backward, to engage our cultural memories, to produce new spaces in which we all might live more fully. I hope you have also heard the words in this book as a call to recognize our roles as teachers and scholars as serious life or death endeavors. For each class of students we teach, or each research study we undertake, is imbued with the possibility of creating something new and different, even better than what already exists. My prayer is that the spirit of our work, Black women teachers remember, has been a dangerous text for you, one that causes you to sit with its words and to imagine their relevance in your life as a teacher. But I also pray that these words light a fire within to remember who you are and who we are together. I believe that in order for teachers to teach all students well, they must know who Black people are in both the length and breadth of our complex histories, cultures, and spiritual traditions. Before we even begin to consider the culturally sustaining pedagogies or abolitionist teaching practices or a more equitable curriculum that we might develop in order to teach, we must have cultural and heritage knowledge enough to be able to marshal these frameworks and strategies in the spirit they were developed. Remembering Black thought traditions, stories, and peoples are prerequisites to helping our students engage in similar processes for themselves. But we must know in order to be able to do. We are calling you to remember that you have much to learn from Black people, a people who didn't just happen to be in the United States. It is through millennia of our singing what the Black National Anthem reminds us of, that treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered, that Black people are still here in Africa and in our diaspora. If you want to know how to teach, On behalf of the whole of Black humanity, you must know and believe in it first. You must, as the Black women in this book have shown you, turn those slave ships all the way around and remember us, not just to heal yourselves, but also, as brilliant scholar Bettina Love says, to heal education. You must see and know the power of the spirit of Black people as a model for healing, the very spirit of education, education that serves or that might serve to liberate and free everybody from the shackles of our woeful and often willful ignorance. Now, I have become a better human because I have learned from decades of lessons from the voices of my students. Maybe you have too. For that and so much more, I thank them. And in the case of this book, I have learned invaluable lessons from the voices of the Black women teachers in our Ghana Study Abroad in Education program on which this book is based. Lessons that inform my life as a teacher educator, and now my life as a dean. Lessons about the kind of teacher education and professional development that honors and remembers Black women and that supports us in our commitments to the academic, social, and spiritual lives of our Black students, particularly, and all of our students more generally. I've learned lessons about the necessity of teachers to be absolutely vigilant, especially in these troubling times, to caring and loving and nurturing our own spirits. Lessons about the power of relationship and love. In a recent dissertation proposal meeting of a Black woman graduate and an alumna of the Ghana Study Abroad program, I learned yet another lesson. I asked Rita to share a bit more about the criteria she was using to select participants for her study. She talked through the criteria and at the very end shared a question that I want to share with you this morning. She said she selects her participants based on this simple question: who has more of the story to tell? And in this process of remembering, that person with more of the story to tell is you. Every human being has cultural and heritage knowledge. We use it every day in every decision we make as teachers, and not all of it is something to be proud of. Some of these memories and ways of being are painful, and other parts are even joyful. They often scare us, making us afraid to explore our depths, our inner depths. But how can we teach well if we don't know what brought us to this place? The stories of our ancestors, movements and their migrations, how we came to be, who we are individually and as a people, and the legacies that we embody. To seek justice and equity in education is to lay these wounds and triumphs bare, the ones inside you and those of your ancestors, because our healing is next to that wound as individuals, as collectives, and certainly in systems of education where we work. And until we can remember and cry for the legacy of inequities and harm caused to Black people, including Black women, name that harm and actively work to repair it, we will never be whole, regardless of the plethora of new models of practice that we want to use in education. And as teachers, we will never be well enough to teach all of our students well. This book is an examination of Black women teachers and our remembrance. It tends to upset people because they're not accustomed to talking about Black women, but this morning, that's who we're speaking of. But these stories are also stories of the Black aunties, mothers, grandmothers, sisters, and Black women students whom we teach or teach about every day. They are the stories of your teacher colleagues who are Black women. They are the stories of that Black woman who might have served you at the bank or the grocery store today or yesterday. These are the stories of Black women elected officials you voted for or didn't. These might even be the stories of a person who you call your best friend. But this call to remembering is for all teachers, not only for Black women teachers. Because to teach any student well, we all must see that Black people generally and Black students particularly also stand within that long and powerful story and that long and powerful legacy that the sisters in this book speak about. Our students are also living Black legacies, and it is their human right to know intimately the Black and African heritages that have birthed them. It is their human right to know intimately their rich knowledge and cultural traditions, not just those from within the borders of their neighborhoods, states, or nations, but also from across the world. And it is also the human right of non-Black students to understand these African and Black legacies too. For it was Europeans who enslaved and stole millions of African people from the continent of Africa to build systems of capitalism in countries in the Americas and the Caribbean. And in the barbaric white supremacy that was that transatlantic trade, it was by design that Black folks not be allowed access to the language of our homelands, our cultural ways of knowing, and the spiritual traditions that guide us. However, make no mistake, it was precisely because our histories and stories were such powerful testaments to our collective spirit and humanities that these life-giving treasures were kept from us. But as Elder Nana Pazant reminded us at the beginning of this book, we still carry that spirit inside we. I want to end by just wrapping up and saying something about the gifts that Black women teachers in this book share with us. I think, though, that a gift is only a gift if, as the receiver, you accept it. Remembering our stories is where we must begin, and it is not optional for those of us who teach or lead. May you be blessed to be the blessing that we need as you take up this incredible life-giving work of teaching, research, and leading in the spirit of our work. Let it be so, and so it is. Ashe, amen, and thank you.
Oh, that was so wonderful. Thank you for the impartation, for the gift that you give, Dr. Dillard. Every time you speak, every time you write, every time I read your work, it's not just academic knowledge, it is definitely a spiritual imparting, and I'm just so grateful. And actually, I want to say, before we get started, that today, actually for me, is the spiritual gift 15 years in the making. So I remember when I began writing my dissertation, and I was writing on spirituality, specifically Black spirituality and the impact of Black spirituality on Black women teachers' work. There weren't a whole lot of guideposts. There weren't a whole lot of maps or charts to get there. I was doing a lot of collage building to make the work possible, but I knew that this is the only thing that I could spend 2 years working on. And so I continue with the pursuit of that research agenda. And when I found your scholarship, you immediately became my academic ear. You became my academic mother. You gave me the language to write about the realities that I was experiencing in my own process to the doctorate, and the realities I was seeing in the women who allowed me to study their work. And so you gave me the frame that I needed to write the project that I needed to write when there was nothing else in the academic world that gave me that frame. And you also gave me the doorway, the pathway to the other scholars that could help me figure out how to piece together this work on Black women and spirituality and education. So I thank you. And all those years that you didn't know my name and you didn't know who I was, and I was just a phantom passing in the wings at a conference, you were, your work and your spirit were guiding me. And so I just think that that is actually quite the power and the testament to what it means to live a spiritually full life is that your spirit is still working all over the place, even when you're not cognizant of it. And so I just want to thank you, and I want to thank the Q Center for this opportunity to be in relationship with you and to be in dialogue with you today. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. I didn't expect, I'm up over here tearing up. And so I didn't come prepared with tissues. So we'll try to make it work. But thank you for that, that sort of grounding. I think oftentimes we don't think very much about the nature of relationship building and the importance of that in an academic and a scholarly and a teaching walk, that you have folks that are those guideposts or maps for you. And then the way that there's nothing more important than building the relationship that helps craft those maps, that helps move us forward. So Kirsten, I remember you as a younger scholar, and it has been a joy to watch you work. And that's the gift that I get from having done some of that earlier work. So I also thank you.
Thank you so very much. Yeah. Well, I guess we'll get into the very professional portion of this.
I don't know how professional I can be. It's just not my nature. So, but we'll see.
We'll see what happens. Absolutely. So I'm going to start, and this is actually a really good bridge to my first question for you. And I apologize, I'm getting over being a little bit under the weather. So I hope my voice is clear. I'm still a little bit working through that. So thank you. So as I read your text, as I read the book, The Spirit of Our Work, which was a delight, as all of your texts have been for me, but definitely a delight. I am struck by the level of intellectual generosity I feel is displayed throughout the text. On almost every page, you celebrate a scholar, an artist, or sometimes even a fictional character like Nanny Pezant from Daughters of the Dusk, another favorite film of mine as well, who has influenced your thinking and the creation of this project. This practice felt to me like not only a rejection of white intellectual individualism, but also a textual form of community building. If I can be so bold, a Sankofa spiritual writing practice, or maybe more precisely an Ubuntu practice in writing. Were you deliberate about reflecting these African spiritual practices in your writing style as you wrote The Spirit of Our Work? Or is your communal engagement with others something that emerged more organically?
In a typical Black feminist response, it is both and. Mm-hmm. So certainly my goal was to write a book from the heart that was also rigorously studied, mm-hmm. but to also write it in a way that my mother could read, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. To write it in a way that that young people could pick up and understand. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't full of a lot of academic jargon, although those of us who needed academic sort of reference could find it there. But I also was, if I was deliberate about anything, it was about making sure that the references that I was drawing on also drew from the long and rich tradition of Black people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And not just Black folks from the United States, but from all over the world, from all over our diaspora. And in some ways, we might think about this writing project as a project that also righted things for me, R-I-G-H-T, that righted things for me because it gave me an opportunity to be able to gather, to remember things that I didn't already know. So yes, to the part about Ubuntu practice in writing. That is a practice of living for me. But yes, also to the deliberate act of drawing on, to the extent I can, in the human body that I'm in, drawing on the texts and the textual generosity, frankly, to use your words, of generations of Black people that don't always find themselves and find their way into academies. It was my way of gathering us. And maybe that showed up a bit more now because I'm a bit more grounded. I'm not sure, but I think it has shown up in everything I've ever written. It's just named now, and it's celebrated now in a very different way, with scholars like yourself and other folks who are now picking up notions of spirituality. It's not foreign anymore in the academy. And so, I think it's both that generosity, both that textual sort of beauty in the words and thought of Black people, but also it's my own remembering represented, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to pick up on a thread that you mentioned in your response to this first question before we move on. You started by saying you wanted to produce a text that was, one, something that your mother could read, that was accessible. We might use the term, the language of accessibility, but was still rigorously studied. So when you say that, I think, okay, one, we often separate those two as dichotomy, as if to be accessible, to be available to the community that matters, means that it might not be rigorously studied. So they have to be both, but we know from a Black feminist lens and both, and rejecting those kinds of binaries. But it does seem to me that to do the work that is spiritually nourishing from an African cosmology, it would transform the definition of rigorously studied.
Absolutely.
And I think when I read and if I could be so bold, when I read your text, I see that. So what rigorously studied means, it's not the same as the traditional academic definitions. And I'm going to stop there, maybe ask you or invite you to think about, or to help us to think of, like, teach us basically in this moment, what it means for a Black spiritually grounded educator to produce something that is rigorously studied, possibly apart from the traditional academic frame.
I'm writing really quickly because I think this is one of those questions that could last forever. But the first thing that popped in my head is, again, another question that we don't often ask about academic work. And I think the question for me is, what is the purpose of the work, right? And the emphasis is on the work. I think for me, the purpose of the work has been to do exactly what you stated at the very beginning, to offer guideposts and openings for younger scholars to see a type of writing and research that doesn't allow them to stand outside of it. Right? So we talk about theory, which literally in Greek means to stand outside of the practice, right? And so one thing I would say is, and I'm not going to get all the things that a rigorous study would look like from a Black cosmological frame, would be that you can't stand outside of your work. You are a part of the work. You are a tool in the work. You are remembering as you work, and you have purpose for your work. So you are not outside of this practice of inquiry or research, right? You are also envisioning, revisioning a new relationship to knowledge. which requires, I think, as a Black scholar, for you to draw on our knowledges. That is not necessarily something that I grew up through the academy doing, but I learned to do it because I recognized that we are not represented there, and that I needed different tools in order to be able to write that thing that allowed me to stand within it. So I think about texts as a really good example. I think about texts who kind of do this for me, and those were my mentor texts. So there's a book that I would recommend for everybody to read in the world, but it's really hard to find and it's out of print now. But it's a book by a Ghanaian author called Ayi Kwe Arma. Arma is the last name. And the book is called KMT, in the House of Life, an epistemological novel. So it's written like a novel, but it is carefully studied. And the book focuses on what research and inquiry was like for Black folks before the invasion of Europeans. It's a novel about that, right? But within that text, you begin to understand how these histories of research came to be in whiteness in a way that was really quite contrary to the way that Black folks did research. That careful study, that need to be in relationship, that need to understand the seasons and nature and the sort of natural responses to land and God, the centrality of spirituality within the practice of research, the need for community to ground that research, all of those things that typically are outside of the kinds of research practices that we learn as academics. But I will tell you today, that it is my understanding of those African practices that help me to write in this way, because I don't write for, I write to inform white colleagues, but I write for Black people. Okay, so I write to heal the fissures and chasms for us who are, especially for us who are in diaspora. And I pray that that work is also helpful and healing for others. Because to the extent that other folks get well is also the extent to which they will quit brutalizing. So I think that's, I write my audience, when I sit to think of who reads the writing that I write, it's a Black audience, and it's more particularly Black women. But I also want to be generous enough to try to change the material conditions and the knowledge traditions of all of us who are academic writers in such a way that Black folks are present. So my long way of answering your very short question.
No, I appreciate all of it. So going back to textual generosity and celebrating others, earlier on in the book, you draw on Patricia Williams, legal scholar, Patricia Williams' notion of murder of the spirit, which I just want to take us a moment to acknowledge how powerful and subversive even Dr. Williams' notion of murder of the spirit in legal scholarship is. So like you're drawing on these other Black feminist writers who are trying to do this kind of subversive work. So I just want to put that in a pocket to the side. To describe the dangers. So Patricia Williams' notion of murder of the spirit to describe the dangers of not remembering for African descended people. You warn against, and I quote you here, the murder of the very essence of who we are and what animates us as spiritual beings having a human experience. Page 5, for those who are interested. This statement really resonated with me. often lamented to friends and colleagues or friendly colleagues that the most, and to my students, quite frankly, the most dangerous violence white supremacy and anti-Blackness inflicts upon African descended people is to trick us into forfeiting our spiritually rich humanity for the spiritually bankrupt ways of knowing and being cultivated in whiteness. And I've been saddened by efforts on the part of Black people that seek supposed liberation and freedom through the same dehumanizing relationalities perfected in white imperialism. Freedom through capitalism, justice through the carceral state, selective empathy. You make a statement on page 179 that quite literally knocked the wind out of me. You state, before we can do anything of educational import, quote, your inner life must be well. Like, even when I read it now, like, I think I might laminate that and put it somewhere just to remember every day. Your inner life must be well. As African descended people living under the terrors of white supremacy, how do we cultivate an inner life that is well?
Mm-hmm. So first, I want to say that the idea of wellness and the inner life is certainly not mine. I stand with Toni Cade Bambara from the Salt Eaters when she talks about the need to be well, and asks us the question: are we sure we want to be well? Because there's lots of weight when you are well, like the expectation you have of yourself and of generations is heavier when you are well. And I think that's part of the seduction. So I've written in the past about how whiteness and white supremacy seduces us away from who we are in real life. So I think probably sort of a fundamental part of that the performance of Blackness, right? That really is drawing on whiteness to perform. It is fundamentally about a lack of example and deep understanding and relationship with people who are well. Right. So I too know the very people you are describing. I think that at every level, some of us are in that space, depending on where we are and how far along in this path or journey we have come. But I do think that having examples of people whose lives are well are really important. So when I think about what it would be like to be in a room with somebody like a Toni Cade Bambara or a Paula Marshall.
Or Cynthia Dillard.
Okay. But to be in their presence is to provide you a different example of what success might mean, of what Blackness might mean, of the possibilities of liberation and freedom through centering ourselves in our own traditions. Many of you know I'm now at a Catholic university, which is really wild, progressive Jesuit Catholic University in Seattle. And the Jesuits have these two notions that I think are really, really important, but they're not solely the people who have these notions, but they're first and foremost in my mind because we think about them in relationship to curriculum and my own trying to come to understand Jesuit spirituality. But they have the first one is alignment, this idea of alignment, that I'm aligned with the traditions and cultures and gods that I understand. And then the second concept is discernment, that with that knowledge and with that alignment, I am able to make good choices and able to make choices that actually create a more just and humane world. I think that's part of what's missing from those of us who get caught up in what whiteness swears it can offer us. I know that and we'll come to this question a little bit later, but I know that you are on your way to the continent. And I do believe that while I'm not willing to romanticize Africa, it has its own challenges and it is not separate from white supremacy at all. What it does offer are a set of examples of what it means, A, not to ever be displaced, B, to sort of hang out in those cultural traditions in ways that you can begin to see that you are not random, but you in fact are on purpose for a purpose. And that kind of, those kinds of examples I think are really, really important. But I have to say, whiteness is seriously seductive. So, but at the end of the day, I don't answer to whiteness, I answer to my God. And we have a real strong relationship around what my work is to do here. And I think what you find with folks walking in those traditions is that there is no sense of purpose that is larger than themselves. And that is fundamental to Black cosmology, fundamental to Blackness. And if it's not there, it's not there. But it also is a cautionary tale for Black folks that we need to discern who is on a particular kind of path and who is on another kind of path, and then make our choices around relationship accordingly.
I'm going to pick up on that a little bit. And I'm going to just throw something out there. And if you want to engage it, you can. If not, we can move right along. But as academics, what do you think? How do I ask this question? What is the relationship? I'm gonna just say it straight up. What is the spiritual relationship between ego and the academy?
Well, first of all, there is no spiritual relationship between ego and much of anything. Right? So ego is what gets us out of the bed in the morning, makes us brush our teeth so we're not offending people. But when we take it any farther than that, ego stands in the way of us being able to understand our purpose and our work. Because it takes us from the collective we to me, right? So there is no spiritual relationship. The challenge with the academy is that all of the rewards are set up such that you're driven in some ways by ego to have those rewards, right? So my own navigation of the academy was all about trying to both attend to the egoistic, individualistic rewards of the academy by doing the work that I knew needed to be done in community. Again, I think I've been a Black feminist since I drew breath, right? So this idea that I'm gonna play in the sandbox because there's some real positive and possible rewards for me personally and for my community, those whom I love, by my presence in this place. So I'm going to trade on those, but I'm going to do it my way and do my work as a model for those who will come after me, but also as a way of being able to live with myself in the academy. Yeah. So ego and spirituality, tough relationship. There's not a whole lot there. But to take up the mantle, if you will, of being aligned and being on purpose for a purpose, which means you've listened to God tell you what it is you're supposed to be doing. That's the relationship I care about. And so therefore, I don't have the same kind of relationship with the academic spaces in which I work. That, I hope that helps answer that question.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think for me, um, I ask you that again, academic ear. So I'm giving they have the opportunity to ask the questions I'm asking. I think even as I have found myself as a mid-career scholar, I guess is the term at this point, and I've kind of reflected on my journey in the academy, it is a constant tug um, with the ego. As a spiritual being, as somebody who strives every day to move through an African cosmology, through an African frame of reference, but being embedded in the academy, I have to admit that that is a constant tug of war for me, because all of the rewards and all of the frames of reference and all of the benchmarks for a successful academic career are inextricably tethered to egocentrism, right? To the ego, and so it's a constant battle for me. And one of the things that has helped me is actually to go back to my family's way of thinking, like my home place way of thinking, where my family treated like you go to work, you clock in, you clock out, and you come home, and work is not your life. This is not your family. This is not your people. This is the place that you get the resources to do the things that you want to do. And so it's kind of that grassroots pedagogy, that curriculum from home, that has been kind of a guiding star for me, and it has been a tool for me to kind of do that ongoing untethering. But it is, to be quite frank, it is quite difficult. There are all kinds of opportunities for the ego to rise up. And so I just wanted to ask that, because I think that sometimes I don't know if we take it seriously, or if we think through it in a deliberate fashion. So we kind of get caught up in the work, and we're not thinking about these spiritual, non-spiritual factors that are actually tainting the work or impeding the work.
And I think that you have to be, any of us who are in academic spaces have to be very clear about why we're there.
Yeah.
Like, why am I here? What work am I doing here? And on behalf of whom is that work? And I think if we're clear about those things, we will also then be clearer, not necessarily without struggle, clearer about the boundaries around those things, about the relationships that are necessary to support those things, about the value of those things. But I think some of us are still very confused about the value of Black scholarship, still very confused about the value of drawing on Black knowledge traditions and Black feminist traditions. I'm not suggesting that's your case at all, but I am saying that as I walk through these halls of ivory, I see this kind of, I'm not sure if it's something I really should do. And what I would, constantly and am constantly engaging with folks, particularly folks, scholars of color, around is you don't have a choice. If you're going to sustain this walk and do work that doesn't continually do harm, you will have to remember. It's not optional. Now, some of us will remember more deeply, but everybody will need to remember, because at every point, whiteness is going to remind you that you are not it. Right? So how do I live, like breathe and find joy? That's what we're going to spend time on this afternoon in the workshop, little teaser. But how do you find joy in this work that you're doing every day? Because I believe that joy is sort of fundamental to the work, and what you recognize in this book and in lots of other places is a whole lot of joy, even as we unpack very painful and hard, difficult things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So joy is not separate from this walk in the academy or in the work of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And if we aren't finding ourselves in love with, in joy with
mm-hmm.
the work we're doing, we need to find something else to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We really do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I refuse, because I'm here and I have stuff to do, and I have people to serve. And therefore, I will find both the strength to do that work, but also the joy within it in order to do it well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay. So you speak about the centrality of spiritual knowing and what Oyewumi describes as world sense in the work of African descended women educators. This emphasis resonated with my own empirical research. All of the Black women who have allowed me to observe their pedagogical and curricular practice have drawn from a deep well of spirituality and ancestral knowing to craft their work. And that's consists of, I've studied at this point, like deeply studied at this point, probably the pedagogical practice and curricular practice of at least 20 Black women educators at this point. Of Black women, specifically educators at this point. And regardless of their specific religious tradition or location in the diaspora, even those who might identify as atheist or agnostic,
Sure.
there is a supernatural knowing and intuition, feelings, divine guidance that have directed their practice. However, when communicating their work professionally, they often felt compelled to attribute these knowings to academic sources in order to gain legitimacy, or they hide their brilliant work altogether. So these cover-ups have always felt to me like a certain kind of theft. These Black women, myself included, felt forced to give credit to, let me just say it, dry-ass academics for their divine impartations received from the Creator, the Orishas, and our ancestors. And so I asked, how might you encourage African-descended educators to navigate and/or avoid spiritual theft in their own academic work?
Oh, I'm not so sure you're going to like this answer. I just don't think you might like this answer, because so there's a couple things going on. One is I think the more clearer we can name spiritual traditions, name spiritual offerings, name spiritual deities or other forms of spirituality, the better. So for many of us, even talking about spirituality is difficult for our mouths, right? So we were academics, we were trained with this separation of spirit and body, spirit and mind, and we learned that, but we also knew better. So at some level, we were conspirators with the theft. Okay, so part of the speaking, part of the naming, it's also about the recovery of all of our stuff, as Njozaki Shange would say, right? So we got to go, we have to be the people who do that work. I think all too often we expect that institutions and those who are within them will do the right thing. And I don't know what in our history suggests that that would be true, but there isn't anything there that would suggest that that is true. And as Moms Mabley often used to say, you know, you keep doing the same old thing over and over again and expecting a different result. That's a sort of kind of crazy, right? So we have to get smarter and we have to get wiser about how it is we choose to engage in the academy. And I think naming is one of those things that we have to do. I remember, if you look at earlier work, since you started there, my own earlier work, spirituality was never named in my first sort of years of academic life. I might have tossed it in, but it was always with intellectualism or something else, theoretical, something, conceptual, something. But it certainly isn't, it isn't as it is now. The more I learned to name the thing and to ground it in traditions that were mine, the more strength I could then draw from them. And I think others could draw from them. I'm circling back to the question you asked earlier, that I could not have written the spirit of our work when I first started as an assistant professor, because I needed to be able to name things that were not yet named in academic spaces. And I needed to be able to draw on traditions that I didn't always know as deeply as I needed to. And I needed to do that within the context of the academy, which meant that I had to also know other knowledge traditions and talk about the ways that we are not smart if we don't know Black folks. We are not smart if we don't know Black feminist theorists. We are not smart if we do not know certain kinds of Black thought traditions. We're just not. And so part of the work was also not so much convincing my colleagues as it was me standing in the traditions that made sense for us. So I think that's part of it. So that naming piece is really important. And that's our work to do, not their, because frankly, when they try to name stuff, it's not useful because it's not of the traditions that they come from. I think there's a couple of questions that might be important to also name, if we will, here about who gets credit for the work that we do. And I think these are things that I just have run into over the years as I've attempted to mentor younger scholars, especially. And I think there are questions that just need to be taken up, whether you are a scholar or a teacher. First, who am I lifting up in this work? Who am I lifting up? What knowledge, what nature of knowledge am I lifting up? Secondly, where is the source of that knowledge, right? Where is the source? And can I cite the source? Can I raise the source up? And if I can't, how do I talk about it anyway? Because, you know, our people theorize all day long, but they don't necessarily have the vocation of theorizing. So how do I talk about this? And then thirdly, how do I move my words and my work closer to a truth that is rooted in what I know and what I have experienced? There's a Bob Marley commercial. It's hilarious. In Ghana, there's a old mattress commercial, but it had Bob Marley's music to the commercial. And there's a line in this Marley song that says, "Who feels it knows it all." I think that last thing, you know, if we feel it, we know it. And how then do we describe it? And how then do we we take it up as a knowing that is truthful and righteous based on the ways that we understand knowledge is constructed? So I think we've got work to do. I'm less concerned about these institutions, but I am very concerned about the work that we have to do about naming our own sources of knowledge as legitimate for us. What folks do in the academy is on them. But here's what I've also found out. People are hurting, and it's not just us. And they are finding ways to not hurt through all kinds of things. If somehow my work, again, or anybody else's work, talking about the Orishas, talking about other forms of spirituality, talking about a relationship with the Creator as central to the work that I do, if somehow that helps somebody, I'm happy about that. I'm happy for them.
Mm-hmm.
But this work is really about sort of standing in traditions so that our young people don't have to continually do this work
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
of being without access to knowledge traditions that can not only help them be smarter, but help them to feel themselves more deeply, especially as Black folks, Black, brown folks, all kinds of folks.
Yeah. I'm gonna pick up on that a little bit because as you were talking, I was thinking this phrase just kept going through my mind. One of my spiritual, I'll say leaders, spiritual guides in my non-academic life often says that sacrifice is the language of the spirit world.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
and as you were talking, I was thinking about what is the sacrifice
Mhm.
that we must make
Mhm.
to walk this academic road.
Mhm.
And I want to just be kind of blunt about that and straight up, because what you're saying is so powerful and so true, but it is not without cost. When I hear you, it seems to me like it's not without cost. And so I want to talk a bit about that cost.
Mhm. Okay, so first I'm going to ask you a question and then I'll answer the one that you've asked. So, and we can parking lot this question, but it's just something I need to ask. So why is that spiritual leader in your non-academic part of your life? So I think that's a question that you've got to sort of answer. If they are that person that helps you do the work in the academy, how are they not in the academy? So I'm just parking lotting that.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so now I've forgotten the question.
What is the cost? Like, can we be real about the cost to follow this path?
Sure. I think I want to start by saying none of us were promised that this human experience would be pain-free.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to think everything's got to be happy, go lucky. We party. No, this life is about struggle and challenge, but it's also about learning from and within that struggle and that challenge. Those things come to teach us. So when the costs come, whether it's not getting tenure or having article rejected or whatever, these are not about me. These are about the lessons I still need to learn. Because if that takes me off of the path, it means that my path wasn't all that solid to start with. So this thing happens and I have to sit with it to figure out what it's trying to teach me. Hopefully I'll learn the lesson and be able to move on. Mm-hmm. But if you think about those powerful places where you've learned, learned something that just turned your head all the way around, it was usually not in joy. It was usually in some sort of difficult, challenging experience that you were having, where you were like, oh shit, oh, sorry. I gotta back up. Wait a minute, I gotta back up. I gotta sit down. I've gotta be quiet. I've gotta try to learn my lesson, whether it's tragedy, grief, whatever is coming, I gotta learn. It's an opportunity to learn. So I don't know. I think the costs in the academy are far smaller than we give them credit for. Like we think not getting tenure, for example, would be the end of our world. And I've watched people, particularly us, but I've watched lots of people do things that are so out of character in order to be able to get this thing called tenure. Now, tenure is granted not by you, but by people outside of you.
Yeah.
So there's something a little bit troubling when you are willing to sort of let hair fall out and not sleep and all kinds of things. Ignore your family, whatever, for something that you have no control over the outcome. I just think we have to be clear about what the work is and recognize there will be costs and try to minimize the challenges of that we will face, but recognize we're going to face some challenges. And those challenges come to teach us. But most of us are not willing to sit and learn that lesson because it's hard. We want out of this pain quick and on to the next thing so that we can be happy again. But if you didn't learn it, it's coming back to teach you again. So try, sit, be in it for a bit and figure out if there's something that you can do that you need to learn in order to be able to move forward on your path as an educator, as a scholar, as a teacher, as a leader. I'm facing one of those right now as a dean. And there is something I know needs to shift, but I'm not exactly sure how to shift it. And I've got to sit with that until I can be clear about what it is that I'm doing in order to move past it. So it doesn't ever go away. You can be old, young, whatever. You're going to have to sit with those challenges. And we as teachers, I think, have to be better at helping children and young people navigate those challenges, not so much by telling them what to do, but by opening a space for them to figure out what to do, to give them time and space to discern what's necessary in order to move forward. Yeah.
It's good. That's good stuff.
Yay.
I feel like I'm at Temple. Sunday service. I want to take notes, but I got to stay focused. I'm sorry, you were saying something, Dr. Dillard?
No, it's the way we talk.
Yes.
And these Zoom sessions are sometimes very difficult because it is unnatural for Black folks not to talk on top of each other. And so it's just part of what we do. If we are in person, we know how to navigate it. But I think on these Zoom screens, it becomes a little difficult to do. So no, I didn't have anything to say. That was just a small amen.
Amen. And Ashe. Excuse me. So again, I felt so much resonance with this text in my own research. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to study a study abroad program that was designed and led by Black women. And it was specifically designed for African descended students. And this program was also intent on visiting a Black nation, so taking Black students in the US context to a Black nation. Something that I was immediately struck by was how strongly the students responded to the experience of being in the majority and having the opportunity to navigate that experience with Black educators. I think that was really important as well. For many of the students, and these students were second, third, and fourth year undergraduates, the experience transformed their relationship to Blackness. They began to understand themselves as part of a larger global Black tapestry. Many of the students use words like grounding, which I think you've used in this talk today, to describe the experience. They felt grounded in Blackness. I also, and you mentioned this earlier too, so I also don't want to romanticize Black nations. They too have been indelibly marked by centuries of white imperialism. Anti-Blackness and white desires exist in Black space as well. As is evidenced in many of the experiences you noted in the spirit of our work in this book. The book is right here, that's why I keep pointing over here. So you are really kind of forthright about that as well. Even as you center joy, you're really forthright about these kind of complications in the text, which I appreciate. However, holding those realities in balance, I'd like you to speak a bit about the power of being in Black space for Black people,
Mm. Wow. Hmm. Oh gosh, there's like 1,000 places I want to start with that question. Um, but I think that many Black people who are attached to Black community, whether we're in diaspora or whether we are on the continent or in the Caribbean or in Canada, wherever we are where Black people have gathered, there is a different way of breathing when you are among Black folks.
Mm-hmm.
This afternoon, we'll talk a little bit about this notion of sanctuary, right? Imagine could be a family reunion. It could be a Sunday gathering. We just finished Juneteenth. For some folks, that was a holiday. But there's something very powerful that happens when we gather.
Mm-hmm.
And those of us who live in, whether we're on the continent or whether we are here, those of us who live amidst white supremacy, which is all of us, we are grateful and glad to gather with Black people,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's a chance for us to breathe. It's a chance for us to recognize ourselves. It's a chance for us to see beauty where beauty might not have been seen the week before. It's a place for us to speak in ways that are natural in our mouths. It's a place for us to eat food that is a part of our traditions. I think that same spirit that we have here when we gather with Black folks in diaspora is the very same spirit that you find in abundance on the continent, right? So it's not that it has been not damaged by colonization or white supremacy. It is just that by sheer nature, there are millions of Black people. It's like the largest homecoming you might ever sort of imagine, right? But there have been fissures, there have been breaks, there have been separations that still need work, not unlike separations that we might have in our family and in our own communities based on sexualities or based on race, based on colorism, based on decisions we've made, based on all of those things. I think the thing that I would say about the Black world is that I see things I have never seen here. So back to that piece about examples. I see things I have never seen here. And it gives me a chance then to think about possibilities in a different kind of way. So you land in Kotoka. Well, I've been going to Ghana long enough to remember when there was a Ghana Airways. And so the very plane that I get on in the United States is flown by a Black man or a Black woman. Flight attendants are all Black. At that time, the people on the plane were all Black, and we were acting all kinds of ways. It was literally the party on the plane. It was our homecoming before we even got to touchdown. Now it's changed now because white folks and other folks have found the continent of Africa and are traveling there in large numbers. And so the flight has changed and those kinds of things have changed. But that feeling of being home hasn't changed for me. I think Black spaces allow us to see stuff we just don't see. You walk in, the newscasters are all Black, the folks at the grocery store are all Black, the bus driver all Black, everybody Black. You go to the beach, the whole beach is Black. You go to, everything is Black. And I don't just mean that in terms of phenotype. I mean that in terms of the ways we are, the culture we are. And that's a very different experience than being here in the United States. And it offers examples. And I think that's the most powerful part of being on the continent. It offers examples we may have never seen before.
Yeah.
But it also gives us a way to understand ourselves more clearly. Okay. That clarity is what your students are describing as grounding, right? That clarity is what happened when I walked down to the beach side after we had done a workshop with some of our students. And there's a young brother who's sitting there on the beach just weeping. And I walk up and I say, what's going on? What's happening? And he looks up at me, and I cry again. He looks up at me and he says, Dr. Dillard, is this what it feels like to be free? That's what's possible on the continent that I think is different than what's possible here, even in Black spaces. That there is a calling, a recalling, a remembering of a past that grounds us in ways that resonate with freedom and liberation more clearly. So even folks who I'll go somewhere else, but I think that's what a place like Ghana or a place like Nigeria, a place like South Africa offers to our students. But I think it only happens, it doesn't happen just sort of happens by happenstance. It happens when someone curates an experience with and for Black people and others. Yeah. So when I look at our study abroad, and you suggested some of these same intentions, we intentionally chose Ghana because we wanted teachers to be able to see more clearly what is African about their African American students. Right? So we spent lots of time in schools. We spent lots of time with kids and teachers. What is it we can learn from Black teachers and Black children on the continent who have not been displaced from their homeland in ways that might help inform how we think about African American kids? If we believe, as Nana Pazant told us, we carry those memories inside we. So I think that's part of it. The person who curates the experience needs to be well. They need to be folks who believe in Black people and in Black knowledge, who embody or definitely embrace those knowledge traditions as useful and beautiful. But it being there shifts the molecules. It just shifts the molecules in you. And I think part of it has to do with you realizing that you're not random and that your traditions are longer than what you know. And that when you see them in their depth, you understand the power that exists within you in a way that it's difficult to see here. Because our Blackness is not, I mean, in terms of our Black traditions, you know, we start them in a place where we are not fully human. And what you see on the continent are full humans. Now, there are struggles. There is a kind of colorism. There's xenophobia in some cases. There's certainly trans and homophobia in lots of cases. But you see yourself in a kind of depth that you didn't even know you needed. That is fertile ground. I wrote a piece one time called "When the Ground is Black, the Ground is Fertile." Yeah. But that is fertile ground for being, for learning, and for leading. So for me, I think, as Tina said in the foreword of my book, I think every Black person, like a pilgrimage to Mecca, should have a pilgrimage to the continent. And I personally think it should be in West Africa, but we could argue that for a long time. Because and paid for by the U.S. government is what she also said. That it would be it's just something that can change you indelibly, because it gives you a depth to yourself and your spirit and your mind, your body that you didn't even know you needed.
Absolutely. I actually was thinking about it in relation to the analogy of the Mecca pilgrimage also came to me as I was reading. So this next question is kind of in relation. So you can speak to it as you choose, of course. But I think I'm trying to get at something a little bit more specific. So I'll just ask the question, we'll talk through it. As I read this text in relation to some of your previous scholarship, I had the impression that this text was engaged with Africa as a place in a deeper way than your earlier work. So meaning, as a student of your earlier scholarship, I regularly felt as if you were encouraging me to forward African spiritual ways of knowing and being in my scholarship and work as an educator. That frame I was talking about earlier, to think through my intellectual labor from the frames offered by African cosmologies. And this text does not depart from that aim at all, definitely still in that same tradition, but there seems to be a greater emphasis on Africa as not just a spiritual frame, but also a physical place, and the power that Black women experience when they interact with the material location. This could be the result of the book's focus on the Ghana Study Abroad and Education program, but it feels different to me. And am I perceiving correctly? And if so, can you speak to the focus on physical place in this book?
When you ask that question, in some ways, I don't really quite know how to answer it. And I think that is telling. It's telling because Ghana, especially, and I'll speak very particularly to Ghana, Ghana is home for me. So it'd be sort of like asking how important is your home? And for me, home has been everything. Like even our houses, our physical houses, this condo that I'm in now in Seattle, they are everything. But Ghana is one of those homes now too. So what you see represented in this particular book that may not be represented in other books is a sense of home that is 28 years in the making, right? And with, I hope, a whole bunch more to come. I have a card in our house in Georgia that it's just a little greeting card, and it says, "Have nothing in your home that is not useful or beautiful." And I feel like that is Ghana. It's all of our homes, like the physical space, but that is the physical space of Ghana for me too. It gives me back, and now it gives me my students and my faculties that I take and other folks who come with me on retreat. It gives us back ourselves in such a joyful way. And this book is really about, for me, it was about painting a picture in the sort of great traditions of Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot and her notion of portraiture, but painting a picture of Ghana specifically, Africa more generally, in all of its goodness, right? It was painting a picture that is beautiful and useful for folks who may not ever step foot on that continent. That's part of what I think is represented here that might not be represented in earlier work. I was very intentional about the story I was telling about the continent, but I was also very intentional about telling the story of these Black women in that place. And so I had to foreground the place in maybe a way that I hadn't foregrounded other texts, that where place didn't seem to matter nearly as much. Most folks don't have a picture of the continent of Africa. And if they do, as so we sort of articulated in the book, it is a warped sense of what that place looks like, feels like, smells like, is like. So I wanted to try to paint that textural picture of the place itself in order to locate Black women from the diaspora in that place in a way that helped folks understand that this is not, again, I don't know that it's optional for us not to attempt to recover or remember those histories and the power that those histories and culture has on us. So that's it may just be a factor of home and the need to sort of draw that picture of home for those who might never return there, and to help us understand how powerful that place is when we return to that place. So yeah, none of us would come away from that experience if somehow Ghana wasn't beautiful and Ghana wasn't useful. There was something about its beauty and its usefulness and its traditions and its history that matters to us. And that was the kind of bridge I was attempting to build by creating that story, and sketching that home place in that way. I don't know if that got to your yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. We are bumping against time, so I'm going to leave my selfish question to the side. I might email you and ask for your advice. But I just want to, first, I want to say you are going to be in a workshop in 30 minutes. I know we were not able to get to the public's questions today. This was much more of a dialogue time, but if you have questions for Dr. Dillard, join her in her workshop. That'll be an opportunity to ask the questions. So that's the main thing I wanted to say. And then the main thing I want to say for CUESEF, and the main thing I want to say is thank you, Dr. Dillard. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your mind, for your spirit, for your love that is always, your love is thick. Your love, like to be in your presence, whether virtually or in person, your spirit, the spirit of your love is just thick and encompassing, and it is the testament to a well-lived life. And so thank you for this opportunity, and I hope you get nice rest for the next 30 minutes you have until you run into your next opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you too, Kirsten. I look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks, everybody.